Welcome to the Gardien Group Podcast Series. The Gardien Group, providing extraordinary solutions to today's exceptional problems.
Hello, podcast fans. Welcome to another edition of the Gardien Podcast Series. I'm your host again, Todd Kolmodin, usually with Rick Meraw, but he's on assignment today. But hey, we got somebody else for you. We've got Stephen Riedman from our Colorado facility. Our Colorado facility does both our standard services, which are standard electrical tests for opens and shorts and all that, but they are also our go-to for what we're going to talk about today, which is our functional fixtures and hybrids. Stephen and I kind of go back about 28 years, if I recall correctly. So welcome to your first podcast there, Stephen.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, when we talk about functional and hybrid fixtures, basically what are they? But first, let's talk about what a conventional fixture is. That's what everybody knows and works with for standard ET bareboard type stuff. And for those of you that are following along with the video podcast, got a slide here that shows some of what we call our conventional fixtures. And Stephen, you guys build all these as well, right?
Yep. We call them universal grid fixtures, and they pretty much build them to any size grid, dual-sided, single-sided, 1 inch up to 3 3/4 inch.
Yeah, your facility is one of ours that does pretty much the whole library of fixture types. Most of our other facilities are kind of wrapped around the 3 3/4 inch music wire type pin, but your facility has a lot of expertise in some of the other types, like you mentioned, 1 inch, 2 inch headed type pins, and as well as the music wire featureless stuff too.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, the headed pins are getting harder and harder to find, but we've got a pretty large inventory still.
And you build fixtures for, not just, Gardien type machines, but you build them for basically anybody's machine out there, right?
Correct.
Okay. Great.
Yep.
Great. Well, what we're going to talk about today is what when we were talking about conventional fixtures, and I basically say those are used for our standard test. A lot of them, they have multiple guided plates in there where the pin deflects. If you've been following along in our series, Rick and I did a podcast recently on high volume versus low volume testing, and we talked a little bit about dedicated or wired type fixtures versus multi-plate guided pins when we talked about the interface of the grid tester and the pin interfacing up to the PCB pad. And that's what we talk here about, multiple guided plates. They're also today's fixtures, they have net list intelligence, which means it's the old term self-learn isn't used anymore, pretty much. There may still be some of that out there. Really not a lot, though. Most of it's all net list intelligence. And, conventional fixtures, we found, there is some limitations on these types of fixtures based on density of the boards and on the fixture tester being used. But dovetailing into that, to what Stephen does at that facility is these hybrid type fixtures or functionals. Two types of things we'll talk about. The functional fixtures, first, what we want to talk about. And Stephen, when we talk about functional fixtures, as compared to a standard ET multi-plate pin fixture or whatever, kind of take us a little walk down the functional fixture avenue.
Well, they're generally a dedicated fixture, which means they're pogo pin and wires. They're used for a variety of applications. They can be programming jigs. They can be device. They can test the functionality of a completed device to check in the functionality of a connector attached already to a circuit board. So we call those through connector test fixtures. But it's just beyond opens and shorts. Included in that, I mean, we've done 4-wire Kelvin fixtures and we've done high pot fixtures. So pretty much once you go beyond opens and shorts, it falls into that functional category.
Okay, would you talk about functional and connectors, and these might be the bare board that's already been tested, and then the customer will do some assembly parts process. They might put coins or put connectors or whatever. And can this still be tested on a fixture type tester though?
Generally not. There's a few applications where you can do, a small through connector on a small circuit board and then adapt that into a universal grid machine. But again, you're still looking for opens and shorts, but you're checking it through a connector. And so we've done a few of those where we adapt the functional fixture back to a universal grid machine.
So would that be something that we would use kind of the term hybrid, where you're wiring? I think what I'm seeing in my mind is what I'm thinking is where you might have a fixture or a board that's larger than the grid tester size or fixture tester size, where you test 90% of the board on the universal grid, but you get creative and can test the rest of the board by wiring pins back into the interface or something to that effect?
Yeah. And so we've taken that just another step, and so we will wire to like a 50-pin connector that then makes connection to the universal grid. And so we can actually wire a completed other fixture back and then cycle it through a universal grid.
Oh, okay, great. I know that some of these fixtures that you build can be rather large. For those of you following along video wise, the slide on there, I think, is probably one of the biggest ones that you've done, I think.
Yeah, that one is 60 inches by 22 inches. And this particular fixture is used for two different things. You can plug into this and do a standard ET test, but then you can also, it will also perform a high pot test.
Okay. And for those of you following along, we've talked about high pot or dielectric breakdown testing, or where you're testing a lot of times plane to plane for isolation, but sometimes it can be net to net for isolation. If they're critical nets, they may want high voltage and isolation in high pot fixtures, which is another forte of what these guys do over there in Colorado. I mean, what is the functional fixture process? I mean, on a standard ET type test, we have certain things we perform, we get to customer requirements and we develop a program and then we basically test the board. But I think there's a little bit more, quite a bit more in the functional fixture process.
Yeah, sometimes the fab drawing spells out what is needed, but most of the time it's a discussion back and forth between, an engineer at a company and what they're trying to do. And also, they may want to add some things that make it more operator friendly, so that you're basically trying to decomplicate the test process. And so some of that we can do through the fixture with switching and start switches and this type of thing. And so once you have that discussion and get the idea of what they're wanting, then you would need to determine, okay, what kind of parts do we need here? What are being supplied by the customer? And then we need to actually get the CAM files and then go in and specifically identify the certain nets or access points to the board that we need to use in the fixture. Then it moves into drilling and many times milling as well, to work around components that may need to be cleared out, or, so that no damage happens to other parts on the board. And then once that's all done, then it goes to pinning, wiring, and assembly.
Yeah, it sounds like in a case of these functionals, your team is an integral part of that with the engineering team at the customer site, rather than, a standard ET fixture flying probe type thing where the order comes in and cam's done and on the machine it goes. It sounds like you're integral in that to make their end result, I guess, kind of what they wanted. It sounds like it's definitely a more involved process.
Yeah, that's where the fun part is interacting with their team and working together to come up with something that is cost effective and usable at their facility.
I know that, Rick and I have talked about in the past about cost of, the standard ET grid fixture tester type affair, where that is, more expensive than obviously a flying probe because you have multiple plates and pins. But when you get into these functional fixtures, as you talked about, the cost is higher because, you have, I believe, sometimes you have a off the shelf kit price that you use that adapts to a certain type of machine, and then you have connectors and various parts and pieces, so the pricing can be, quite a bit higher than a standard dedicated type fixture, correct?
Yes, that's correct. The cost of components for these are in some cases 5 times more. In other cases, it can be up to 10 times the cost, but just depends on the complexity of what you're trying to do.
Well, I know that we use your group, for most of this go-to, even for what we call hybrid or switching type fixtures, which we talk about those. Stephen mentioned a little bit about HiPot, the dielectric testing. Sometimes there's what we call pairs, which is a pair would be 2 different points that are used to test your sense and force and sense to find out if there's a dielectric breakdown. But sometimes there's a lot of pairs and fixtures that are used for that can be that does all of that. We actually lean on the guys over there in Colorado as well, which we call the HiPot switching or switching matrix hybrid. Well, explain to us a little bit about that, how those work, Stephen.
Okay. So there's 2 different types of switching HiPot. The most common one is, many times a HiPot test is, as you indicated, a test pair, but there's also many different boards that have test groups, and so they want group 1 tested to group 2 and group 1 tested to group 3 and 4, and so we can tie all of those groups together to be one connection. And so it's almost like your fingers reaching out to multiple different positions, and so you can check all of those at one time. And then
kind of like a spider grabbing all pieces of the web at the same time.
Correct.
Yeah.
And then the other one is where you need to select one net and test it against 3 or 4 others. And then the next level or the next step in the test is you need to still have that net, but add another net. And so we can, by the use of a switch, connect those 2 nets for step 2 of the test. And then step 3, we can add in a 3rd net and go both ways. And so you can start with them all connected and then work your way down by removing a net and testing them, or tying them together. And actually, the third one is what they call an all net compare. And so they'll give you a list of nets that they want high pot tested to each other. And so on a flying probe, you would have to take the first one and test it to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then the next one to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and it makes very high test counts.
Yeah, that's a long test.
But we can use a switch there also. We use an on switch, and so basically what you're doing is you're moving one net to in this case we're using banana plugs, and so we can, by the use of a switch, move a net from banana plug 1 to banana plug 2, and as you work your way down the list, you're separating and connecting those nets. And so it's, if there was 10 different nets, you can do it in 10 cycles, where if you did it on a prober, you're up in the 70 to 80 test cycle range.
Oh my. So it sounds like we're basically developing multiplexing on these fixtures.
Yeah.
That allows us to really take a lot of time out of doing it. That's great stuff. Well, I know, Stephen, that this was your first time doing this, and I think you just came through with flying colors. What do you see looking in the crystal ball out there of this type of work ramping up? Do you see it stable, or do you see more demand on this, that they find that this can be done relatively, I wouldn't say affordably, but I would say conveniently, by someone, group like us or yourselves? Do you see this stable or growing?
I think the biggest issue is, especially for board shops or other users in the high pot field, especially, is just the awareness that it can be done differently than, just as it's spelled out on the fab drawing. And from the affordability standpoint, when you compare, an $800 fixture to having to test 90 test pairs, all of them at 30 seconds and sometimes 60 seconds, the time savings that you get on a fixture, the return on investment is very short. And then on the functional side of things, again, there's multiple players out there, and I think what we bring to the table is a bunch of good guys who are going to figure out what you need, and very definitely at a lower cost than many of the other options out there.
That's perfect. And I like how you phrase that. We're a group of guys, a good old boys, that we actually want to work with you and not tell you what you need. Is basically, like Stephen talked about, in a functional fixture development, working back and forth with the group to make sure they get what they want and the way they want it, right?
Correct. Been doing it for a long time, and that's the key, is developing good, trusting, solid relationships.
Absolutely. One thing I didn't touch on very well when I was talking about, parts and pieces and pricing and all that. Have you noticed product scarce or parts scarce because of the global shortages, or is it affecting you? I know you mentioned headed pins on the conventional type fixtures are getting harder to find, but some of the stuff that you work with the functionals, you find any issue with supply chain?
Just the length of time.
Lead times.
Yeah, lead times in general are a little bit longer. They're not bad. Late last fall, I think they peaked for what we were seeing, and so we did stockpile on some of the key parts that we knew we would use, just because I had to go 3 and 4 suppliers deep to find them, and but in general, it just seems to be lead times, and they've come down some again, but they're still averaging probably 3 to 4 weeks, where they were 1 to 2 weeks.
Okay. Well, Stephen, I want to thank you for joining us today, joining me, I should say, talking about functional fixtures and hybrids. And your group in Colorado is the place to go for these type of things. And for any of you watching and you want to get a hold of us, drop us a line at info@gardien.com. That's info@gardien.com. Check us out, or check the website at www.gardien.com, I should say. And if you're check us out, check out our series of podcasts on Buzzsprout, Apple Podcast, or your favorite platform, wherever that may be. And for Stephen Reedman and myself, we thank you for joining us. Look forward to seeing you on our next podcast.